I want to start today with a question. If your child needed surgery to survive and the only thing standing between them and that surgery was your signature, would you sign? Most of us don't even need to think about that. Of course you would. You'd sign anything. But right now in South Africa, there is a teenage boy whose liver transplant has been delayed for months. And the reason it hasn't happened is because his father won't sign, not because he doesn't love his son. He would tell you the opposite, that everything he's doing is out of love. He won't sign because he's a Jehovah's Witness. And the Watchtower organization has told him that accepting a blood transfusion, which the surgery requires, is against God's law. In the meantime, a child waits. The health minister has already said the hospital should approach the High Court if necessary, and the courts may now have to step in. And all of this is happening just days after the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses announced a major change to their blood policy. A change that, on paper, gives Jehovah's Witnesses more freedom over their own blood than they have had in decades. And we will get into how the new policy change that was recently announced affects this case a little later. So why is this boy still waiting? So let me walk you through what we actually know about this case, because the details matter. The case is out of South Africa. A boy about 15 years old needs a liver transplant. His doctors say the surgery is necessary. His doctors also say that a blood transfusion is part of that procedure, standard medical practice for that type of surgery. His family, who are Jehovah's Witnesses, have refused to consent to the transfusion. And because he is a minor, his parents' consent is legally required. So the surgery has not happened for months. The story was picked up by The Witness and other South African outlets. They spoke to Nomfundo Mthembu, a medical law specialist at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She explained that under South African law, the High Court acts as the upper guardian of all minor children in the country. And that means when a parent's decision conflicts with the child's best interest, the court can override that parent. The health minister, Aaron Motsoaledi, has also weighed in. He said publicly that the hospital should ask the court to intervene if the parents keep refusing consent, because the state has a duty to protect the child's right to life. So what does this tell us? It tells us this is not going away quietly. The department is involved. A legal expert is publicly commenting on the court's authority, and the health minister is on record, and a child is still waiting for surgery. And it is not the first time South Africa has been here. Because here's what I really want you to understand. This is not a one-off. This is a pattern, and South Africa has the case history to prove it. In 2018, 3 children aged 9, 5, and 3 were admitted to hospitals in Durban with severe anemia or sickle cell anemia. All of them needed blood transfusions. And in all 3 cases, the families refused consent because of their religious beliefs as Jehovah's Witnesses. And the KwaZulu-Natal Health Department took those families to the Durban High Court. The court granted an interim order allowing doctors to administer transfusions if the children's conditions deteriorated. At least one child ultimately received blood under that order. The families fought back. They submitted medical papers suggesting alternatives. They argued their rights as parents, but the court had already decided that when a child's life is at risk, the child's right to life takes precedence over the parent's religious belief. And it goes back further than that. There was a 12-year-old girl with leukemia in Johannesburg. She and her parents refused a transfusion she needed to survive. The Johannesburg High Court ordered the doctors to go ahead. She received the transfusion and she lived. There was a 4-day-old premature baby born 15 weeks early whose parents refused consent. The Pietermaritzburg High Court granted an urgent order and the transfusion happened. And each time, the same pattern: a child in danger, a parent's sincere religious belief, a court that steps in and says the child's life comes first. And each time the Watchtower organization is somewhere in the background, having trained these parents for years that blood is sacred, that refusing it is obedience to God, and that accepting a blood transfusion could cost them their standing in the congregation. That is the context for this boy today. And for those of you watching for the first time, I want to explain briefly what Jehovah's Witnesses actually believe about blood, because that's the engine under all of this. The Watchtower's position is that accepting a blood transfusion is a sin. They base this on several Bible passages, mainly Acts 15:28-29, which tells Christians to abstain from blood, and Old Testament texts in Genesis and Leviticus that treat blood as sacred. Their interpretation is that abstaining from blood means you cannot deliberately take another person's blood into your body. And by extension, you cannot allow your child to either. Their medical literature says that God views blood as representing life, and that witnesses avoid taking blood out of obedience and respect for God as the giver of life. But here's where it gets complicated. The policy is not as absolute as it looks on the surface. Over the past few decades, and as we have just seen with the recent announcement, the organization has approved more and more blood-derived products and procedures as matters of conscience. Albumin, clotting factors, and various plasma derivatives, and autologous techniques like hemodilution and cell salvage, where blood leaves the body briefly and is then returned. At the same time, they have held a hard line against transfusions of whole blood and its four primary components. That's red cells, white cells, platelets, and plasma, whether from a donor or, until now, when stored in advance as your own blood. And that brings us to what just happened this month. On March the 20th, 2026, the governing body released an official video, Governing Body Update number 2, clarifying their position on this use of a patient's own blood in medical and surgical care. And I would put clarifying in quotes. In that update, governing body member Gerrit Lösch says that each Christian must decide for himself how his own blood will be used in medical and surgical care, including whether it may be removed, stored, and then given back to him. In other words, what used to be explicitly prohibited, preoperative donation and storage of your own blood for later reinfusion, has now been moved into the personal decision category. At the same time, the organization is clear that nothing has changed about donor blood. Receiving transfusions of another person's whole blood or its main components remains off limits and can still result in you being treated as having left the religion. So what does that mean in practice? It means that a Jehovah's Witness facing a planned surgery can now, in theory, talk to their surgeon about banking their own blood in advance without automatically violating Watchtower doctrine. It widens the range of medically sensible options that are allowed, at least on paper, for witness patients. And it also raises a very uncomfortable question. If this is now a conscience matter in 2026, what does that say about the witnesses who were told for decades that the very same procedure was categorically forbidden? And I want to slow down here, because it's easy to miss how big this is. Now, in one video, the governing body has effectively admitted that at least part of that strict line was human, not divine. They haven't used those words, but anytime a policy moves from absolutely forbidden to up to you, they are telling you that faithful witnesses in the past had fewer options than they actually needed to. So when you hear a governing body member tell members that each Christian must decide for himself how his own blood will be used, there are two truths sitting side by side. One, this genuinely gives current witnesses more room to make life-saving decisions without fearing automatic expulsion. And that could save lives going forward. And number two, it does nothing for the families who were told last year or 10 years ago or 40 years ago that the same decision now was forbidden, that storing and using their own blood was disobedience to God. The policy has changed. The costs of the old policy are still there. So how does this connect back to the boy in South Africa? In one sense, it doesn't, at least not directly. His doctors are talking about standard component therapy for a liver transplant, red cells, plasma, platelets, and so forth. Those are still labeled as off limits by the organization when they come from a donor. So even after the new ruling, if his father signs consent for a normal transfusion, he still risks being viewed as having abandoned his faith. But in another sense, the connection is very direct, because this new policy exposes just how much of this is about organizational control rather than a timeless divine rule. The governing body has now said out loud that something once listed in their own literature as forbidden, storing your own blood, is actually something each witness must decide before God. If that can change, what else can change? And more importantly, what does it say to this father and to others in his position that the men in New York can move the line like this after decades, but the person who will live with the consequences of their decision is him and his son and their family? South African courts, like courts in many countries, try to balance religious freedom with a child's right to life. And when the High Court steps in, and based on past cases, that is still the most likely outcome if doctors apply. It is not just stepping between a parent and a child. It's stepping between a family and a powerful organization that has shaped that family's conscience for years. The Watchtower doesn't sign the consent form. They don't appear in the courtroom. But their policies, their videos, their clarifications are written all over that teenager's medical chart. So where does this go from here? Based on South African legal precedent, if the boy's condition continues to deteriorate, the hospital or the health department will likely approach the High Court for an urgent order, exactly as they've done in previous Jehovah's Witness blood cases. And the court has usually granted those orders. Whether the father consents voluntarily before that happens, we don't know. Whether the boy himself has expressed his own wishes, we don't know that either. And that matters legally because South African courts do listen to older children in cases like this. What we do know is that a child has been waiting for months, and that every week this continues is a week his condition could be getting worse. And we know this. While he waits, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses has just made it easier for some witnesses to store and use their own blood, and left others, like this family, still trapped between their conscience, their community, and their child's life. Keep subscribing and help me reach 5,000 subs. Also like, comment, and share. It helps this video reach more people. Until next time.